Now we're going to begin looking at the Harlem Renaissance. Beginning around 1910, Harlem became a favorite destination of African Americans. Now, Harlem is a neighborhood, a predominantly African American neighborhood on the island of Manhattan in New York City. And New York City has many different ethnic neighborhoods, Harlem being one of them. But Harlem was one favorite destination for African Americans during the Great Migration. And the Great Migration really began mostly during World War I, when the need to produce new materials, particularly to support the war effort, led to many factory jobs in northern cities, and many African Americans began to leave the South, where they had faced oftentimes racial violence. They had legalized segregation in the South. You had many African Americans working in very low-paying jobs, like working as sharecroppers and tenant farmers. And so the lure of moving to northern cities was very real. So many African Americans did move north looking for these opportunities. Many landed in Harlem, New York. Many landed in Chicago and Detroit and in other northern cities. African American newspapers helped to spread the word of opportunities in northern cities, and once again, that whole time period was referred to as the Great Migration. Now, many found opportunities in the North, but they also found racism. Racial tensions were especially high after World War I because you had competition for jobs. Many white soldiers returned home looking for work, and then there was competition. And that led to a wave of racial violence, particularly during the summer of 1919. The deadliest riot occurred in Chicago, Illinois. And this one started when you had some African Americans that they were playing on a raft on the beach, or I should say just off the beach, and they began to drift down in towards the white areas of the beach. And while they were on the raft, there was a white man on the shore who was, throwing rocks at them. And, at first they just thought it was kind of a joke, and they yelled, duck, and they would try to duck and avoid being hit until one of them gets struck in the head. And he ends up dying. And, after they get him ashore, and then a white police officer on duty refused to arrest the white man that was throwing the rocks, but instead arrested a black man. That's what really touched off the Chicago race riot. And so in the end, it left 38 people dead and nearly 300 injured. And racially motivated riots occurred in about 24 other cities during the year of 1919 as well. African Americans are another factor that contributed to the racial tensions was the changing expectations of African Americans. Many served during World War I. In fact, groups such as the Harlem Hellfighters fought very bravely and were decorated for their war service, particularly being recognized by the French. But they expected that they would return home and would be on more equal footing, that their war service earned them equal rights. Unfortunately, not everybody agreed with them, and that oftentimes led to violence. Some whites were determined to keep the African Americans back. So, as I previously mentioned, New York City was one of the northern cities that many African Americans moved into during the Great Migration. And by the early 1920s, about 200,000 African Americans lived in the city, most of them living in the neighborhood of Harlem. And Harlem became the unofficial capital of African American culture and activism in the United States. A key figure in Harlem's rise was W.E.B. Du Bois, someone we've talked about before. He was a well-educated Massachusetts-born African American leader. And in 1909, Du Bois helped to found the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, an organization that is still around today. Du Bois also served as the editor of a newspaper, or a magazine rather, called The Crisis. And the crisis was a major outlet for African American artists and writing, particularly poetry and writing, which helped to promote the African American arts movement during the Harlem Renaissance. Another famous figure was Marcus Garvey. He was a Jamaican-born American who took pride in his African heritage. He formed the Universal Negro Improvement Association, or the UNIA, which promoted self-reliance for African Americans without white involvement. Garvey wanted American blacks to go back to Africa and to create a new empire there just for blacks. He also supported Pan-Africanism, or a movement to unite all African blacks. And his Black Star Line promoted trade among Africans around the world. About 2 million mostly poor African Americans joined the UNIA. Garvey thought that the NAACP discouraged African American self-confidence and that their goal of breaking down barriers between the races threatened African racial purity. Now, of course, that expression, racial purity, might kind of stand out because, those are terms that we heard Adolf Hitler use during World War II when he talked about the master Aryan race. Those are also terms. This idea of racial purity is a term we've heard from the KKK. So Garvey very much in a way was a racist as well. He wasn't for the mixing of races. Wasn't particularly concerned about breaking down barriers. He was more concerned about trying to make blacks completely self-reliant and independent. And so this, of course, leads him into conflict with Du Bois. The two really don't like each other. Du Bois and the NAACP were suspicious of Garvey as well, and the Crisis published an investigation of the UNIA. And the FBI charged the UNIA with mail fraud, and the UNIA collapsed when Garvey went to prison and then left the country upon release. Now, during the 1920s, Harlem, of course, partially thanks to the Crisis, was home to tens of thousands of African Americans from the South who felt a strong sense of racial pride and identity in this new place. And that spirit attracted a historic influx of talented African American writers, thinkers, musicians, and artists, resulting in the Harlem Renaissance, an artistic movement within the African American community that was centered in Harlem. As far as the writers, one of them was James Weldon Johnson, who was an American author, politician, diplomat, critic, journalist, poet, anthologist, educator, lawyer, songwriter, and in his spare time, an early civil rights activist. Zora Neale Hurston was an American folklorist, anthropologist, and author during the time of the Harlem Renaissance. Poets like Claude McKay and Langston Hughes wrote of black defiance and hope. These poets recorded the distinctive culture of Harlem in the 1920s. Black artists won fame during this era, often focusing on the experiences of African Americans. William H. Johnson, Aaron Douglas, and Jacob Lawrence were well known. The Harlem Renaissance helped create new opportunities for African American stage performers who only began being offered serious roles on the American stage in the 1920s. Paul Robeson came to New York to practice law, but won fame on stage performing in movies and stage productions like Othello. Robeson also played in the groundbreaking 1921 musical Shuffle Along, which had an all-black cast. Josephine Baker was also in that show, and she went on to a remarkable career as a singer and dancer in the United States and in Europe, where black performers were more accepted. Harlem was a vital center for jazz, a musical blend of several different forms from the Lower South with new innovations in sound. Much of jazz was improvised or composed on the spot. Louis Armstrong was a leading performer on the Harlem jazz scene. Other performers included Bessie Smith, Cab Calloway, and composers Duke Ellington and Fats Waller.